More endocrine. So now we're going to do the adrenal cortex and talk about the adrenal gland in general. So the adrenal gland has two parts, like I drew before on the board. I said that it looks like a Dorito chip. I must have been hungry when I thought about this. Dorito chip. AC, AC, amen. 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 So, adrenal cortex releases aldosterone, cortisol, and we're missing something. We said that it also secretes testosterone, but it's not as fun and mnemonic unless I say AC, AC, amen. Amen stands for adrenal medulla. It releases epinephrine and norepinephrine. Epinephrine in greater abundance than norepinephrine. Epinephrine about 80% and norepinephrine about 20%. So let's toggle back and take a look at the mnemonics and what we're going to try and cover for the adrenal gland. So AC, AC, amen. Aldosterone and cortisol are released from the adrenal cortex. So adrenal cortex, aldosterone, cortisol. Adrenal medulla, epinephrine, norepinephrine. Endocrine system and nervous system. Gophers, Acth. These are some of the layers of the adrenal cortex, and each layer releases something specific. Gophers, Acth. Gophers, Acth. Let's see what that means. So first off, what are the two layers of the adrenal gland? We said it was the adrenal medulla and the adrenal cortex. Which one is the cover? Cortex. Which one is the middle? Medulla. What hormones do they secrete? We said amen, AC, AC, amen. Adrenal cortex, aldosterone, cortisol, and testosterone. Adrenal medulla, epinephrine and norepinephrine. Which one more? Epinephrine. Which one less? Norepinephrine. What about the percentage? 80, 20%. So 80% for epinephrine, 20% for norepinephrine. Here we go. The adrenal gland sits on top of the kidney. And here's a mnemonic you're going to hear me say over and over again. What color is the kidney? Red. What color is the kidney? Red. What color is the kidney? Red. Red stands for renin, EPO, and vitamin D. We'll cover that later. So Gophers, Acth. From outside in, this is actually a picture of the adrenal cortex, but they're taking a look at it from the bottom of the Dorito chip. So let's try and see what they did. They're taking a cross section here. So when we do our mnemonic, we're doing it from here. It's the same thing because the layer is still 1, 2, and 3. So it's 3 layers, G, F, and R. And let's take a look at what those 3 layers are. And the hormones that each layer makes are A, C, and T. What it means is this. GFR, zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, don't worry about this extra AL in cortex, and zona reticularis. So one more time, GFR, zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, and zona reticularis. One more time, GFR, zona glomerulosa, fasciculata, and reticularis. So what hormones come from each? Glomerulosa releases aldosterone. Fasciculata releases cortisol, and reticularis releases testosterone. So here's how to remember it. Gophers, Acth, Gophers, Acth. Let's write this. It's more fun to see it than it is to try and look at a chart on a PowerPoint. Gophers, Acth. Salt, sugar, sex. The deeper you go, the sweeter it gets. So Gophers, Acth, salt, sugar, sex. The deeper you go, the sweeter it gets. One more time, let's say it together. Gophers, Acth, salt, sugar, sex. The deeper you go, the sweeter it gets. So zona glomerulosa releases aldosterone. Aldosterone is associated with the reabsorption and conservation of salt from the kidney. It also drags in water. So aldosterone is related to blood pressure. Fasciculata, zona fasciculata releases cortisol. Cortisol is a glucocorticoid. That means it is sugar-like. Sugar. And zona reticularis is associated with the release of testosterone. Testosterone is a sex hormone. Sex. Salt, sugar, sex. The deeper you go, the sweeter it gets. So these are the 3 layers of the adrenal cortex, the 3 hormones that are released from each layer, and also the 3 associated, let's say, concepts. What causes the release of ACTH? What did I say? I guess we haven't covered this yet, so let's erase all of this and let's draw a new diagram for concept. So we have a couple of things to think of. If I have too much aldosterone, what happens to blood pressure? Blood pressure will go up because aldosterone affects salt and water conservation. That means how much salt and water do you retain and hold on to? The more salt and water you have, the higher the blood pressure goes. What happens if I don't have as much aldosterone? The opposite is true. I lose salt, I lose water, then blood pressure will go down. What about cortisol? Cortisol is a stress hormone, but it's also the key to this entire pathway. So remember, cortisol is key. Cortisol is key. Cortisol is key. And then I have reticularis. Reticularis, that zone releases testosterone. We're going to see how testosterone is affected by this entire pathway. Let's start with cholesterol. Cholesterol is the very start of this entire pathway in the adrenal cortex. What happens is ACTH. Where does ACTH come from again? I think it comes from the pituitary, right? And what is above the pituitary? So I'm going to draw it to the side so that we can see it. Oh, without the arrow. So ACTH comes from the pituitary. But who acts on ACTH? CRH. Right? And CRH comes from the hypothalamus. Okay, so we can kind of see that. Now, ACTH encourages the movement of cholesterol into this entire pathway. So we're putting lines because you don't have to memorize all the enzymes in this pathway. You just have to know the final outcomes. And what are the final outcomes? We say the first one is aldosterone. What is the second one? Cortisol. And who is key? Cortisol is key. And then what's the third one? Testosterone. So ACT, adrenal cortex. Adrenal corticotropic hormone acts on the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone, cortisol, and testosterone. Who is key? Cortisol is key. In order for aldosterone, the final step in the creation of aldosterone, in order for aldosterone to be released, made, and used, I need angiotensin 2, we'll cover that later, or high potassium levels. Okay, angiotensin 2 or high potassium levels. Cortisol is key. Cortisol is key. Cortisol is a stress hormone. So let's talk about having too much or too little of this, too much or too little of this, maybe even too much or too little of this. Cortisol. If I have too much cortisol, maybe let's hold off on cortisol. Let's continue with this idea. So corticotropin releasing hormone, CRH, comes from the hypothalamus to act on the anterior pituitary to release ACTH, which stimulates the release of cortisol from the adrenal gland. Cortisol is a stress hormone. Short term, yes, it's great. Mobilizes energy, helps us to increase glucose so that we can use it elsewhere, maybe in response to injury. Like it also helps with inhibiting the inflammatory response. So it's used as injectables in the knee if you have arthritis, in the elbow, anywhere that you have problems with inflammation, they can use cortisol to prevent inflammation. Long term, it is not a good thing.